Hello everyone, I'm Jiang and welcome to Jiang Decoded. Here we go beyond the headlines to understand the deeper forces shaping geopolitics, global trade, and the balance of power. Over the past week, international attention has focused on one question. How far could the confrontation between the United States and Iran escalate? Reports describe multiple American strikes targeting military infrastructure inside Iran, while governments and financial markets watch closely for Tehran's response. As tensions rose, many analysts expected one scenario above all others: a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. Yet something different happened. Instead of announcing a complete closure of one of the world's most important shipping routes, Iran's response appeared far more measured. Reports pointed to selective attacks against commercial vessels rather than an attempt to block the entire waterway. At first glance, that distinction may seem minor.
In reality, it could reveal far more about strategic thinking than many of the louder headlines. To understand why, we first need to appreciate what makes the Strait of Hormuz so important. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and serves as one of the world's most critical energy corridors. A significant share of internationally traded oil passes through these waters every day. Countries across Asia, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea, depend heavily on uninterrupted maritime traffic through this route. European markets also feel the effects whenever uncertainty rises in the region. Because of that reality, the Strait has long occupied a unique place in strategic planning. Military analysts, policymakers, and energy markets have often treated it as one of the world's most consequential geopolitical pressure points. For decades, one assumption has repeatedly appeared in strategic discussions. If military confrontation between Washington and Tehran reached a critical level, Iran might attempt to severely disrupt shipping through the strait. Whether such an operation would succeed is a separate question. The important point is that even the possibility has influenced global planning for many years. So when military pressure increased recently, observers naturally began asking the same question once again. Would the strait remain open? At least for now, the answer appears to be yes. That decision deserves closer examination. One common explanation suggests Iran simply lacks the ability to threaten maritime traffic on a larger scale. However, many defense analysts argue the issue is more complicated than capability alone. Iran possesses coastal missile systems, naval assets, drones, fast attack craft, and geography that could complicate commercial navigation under certain circumstances. Exactly how effective those systems would be during an extended conflict remains a matter of debate. But capability alone does not fully explain strategic behavior. Governments often choose not to employ every available option. Sometimes restraint communicates just as much as escalation. That raises a more interesting question. If broader disruption remained a possible option, why avoid using it? One possible explanation is that selective pressure creates uncertainty without triggering the consequences that could accompany a total blockade. Consider how international shipping actually works. Commercial transportation depends not only on physical access, but also on confidence. Shipping companies evaluate risk continuously. Insurance providers reassess exposure. Energy traders respond to perceived instability long before supply is completely interrupted. As uncertainty increases, transportation costs often rise. Insurance premiums may climb. Freight routes can change. Oil prices may react even before physical shortages appear. In other words, markets often respond as much to expectations as to actual disruption. From that perspective, limited actions against individual vessels, if confirmed, could influence commercial calculations without necessarily producing the wider economic shock associated with closing the entire strait. Whether that was the intended objective cannot be known with certainty, but it illustrates how modern geopolitical competition frequently operates. Sometimes the message matters as much as the physical damage. A carefully measured response can create strategic uncertainty,
while preserving flexibility for future decisions. That distinction becomes especially important during periods when political leaders are balancing military pressure with diplomatic considerations. Rather than exhausting every available option immediately, governments may choose responses that preserve room for negotiation while still demonstrating capability. Understanding those incentives helps explain why international crises often unfold through gradual escalation instead of sudden, all-or-nothing decisions. And once we begin looking at the situation through that broader strategic lens, another question naturally emerges. If this was not simply a military response, who was the real audience for the message? Because in geopolitics, actions are rarely directed toward only one country. Sometimes they are intended for allies, sometimes for rivals, and sometimes for partners whose support may become even more important as the crisis continues. There, we go beyond the headlines to decode the forces shaping geopolitics, global power, economics, and the future of our world. Today, we're examining a decision that may prove more significant than the military strikes themselves. For several days, international attention has remained fixed on the growing confrontation between the United States and Iran. Military installations were reportedly targeted. Regional tensions intensified. Financial markets reacted. Energy traders watched every development. Around the world, one question dominated discussions. Would Iran close the Strait of Hormuz? For decades, that possibility has been treated as one of the most serious risks in global geopolitics. Each time tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, analysts return to the same assumption. If Iran comes under enough military pressure, it could attempt to disrupt one of the world's most important shipping routes. This expectation has shaped military planning, diplomatic strategy, and energy security calculations for years. Yet as the latest crisis unfolded, something unexpected happened. The strait remained open. Instead of a complete disruption to international shipping, reports suggested a far more selective response involving commercial vessels operating near the region. That distinction may seem small, but strategically, it could represent a very different approach. To understand why, we first need to understand what makes this narrow stretch of water so important. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. A substantial portion of internationally traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes through these waters every day. Energy exports from Gulf producers rely heavily on this route. Major economies across Asia, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea, depend on uninterrupted shipping through the strait. European markets also remain highly sensitive to any disruption. Because of this, even the possibility of instability can affect global markets. Oil prices respond. Shipping companies reassess risk. Insurance premiums often increase. Governments begin evaluating contingency plans. In modern geopolitics, perception alone can move billions of dollars. This is an important point that is often overlooked. A waterway does not have to be physically blocked for economic pressure to emerge. Sometimes, uncertainty itself becomes a strategic tool. When commercial operators begin questioning whether a route is safe, costs rise long before trade actually stops. Shipping companies may delay departures. Insurers may increase premiums. Some vessels may seek alternative routes despite higher operating expenses. Financial markets react to expectations just as much as confirmed events. This is why confidence has become almost as valuable as physical security. Once confidence begins to weaken, the economic consequences can spread surprisingly quickly. That brings us back to Iran's response. Many observers initially asked whether Iran lacked the capability to impose greater pressure on the strait. However, numerous defense specialists argue that capability is only one part of the equation. Iran has spent decades developing coastal missile systems, naval assets, drones, fast attack craft, and defensive positions overlooking key sections of the northern coastline. Exactly how effective those systems would be during a prolonged conflict remains uncertain. Military outcomes are rarely predictable, but the broader point remains important. Having the capability to create disruption is not the same as choosing to use it. History shows that governments frequently avoid employing every option available to them. Sometimes, preserving an option for the future provides greater strategic value than using it immediately. That raises a different question. Perhaps the more important issue is not whether Iran could increase pressure. Perhaps the real question is why it chose a more limited approach instead. Selective actions create a different type of pressure. They demonstrate reach, they generate uncertainty, they remind markets that risks exist. Yet they stop short of triggering the full international consequences that might accompany a complete closure of the strait. This kind of calibrated response offers flexibility. It signals capability while leaving room for future decisions. It also avoids forcing every major trading nation into an immediate crisis response. That distinction matters, because geopolitics is rarely about the largest possible action. More often, it is about carefully managing escalation. Every move sends a message, not only to an opponent, but also to allies, trading partners, investors, regional governments, and global powers watching events unfold from a distance. In international politics, actions frequently communicate more than official statements. Sometimes, silence, combined with carefully measured decisions, tells the world exactly how a government intends to manage a crisis. Which brings us to the deeper question. If the decision was deliberate, who exactly was meant to receive that message? Because Washington was almost certainly not the only audience. Regional partners were watching. Energy markets were watching. And perhaps most importantly, Beijing was watching. Understanding why that matters changes the entire strategic picture. As we've explored throughout this analysis, the most important question may not be whether any side achieved a tactical advantage this week. The more important question is what these decisions reveal about the future direction of international competition. History rarely turns on a single military operation. Instead, major shifts in global influence usually unfold over years, sometimes decades. Military power remains important, but so do economics, technology, industrial capacity, diplomacy, energy security, and long-term strategic planning. Modern geopolitics is increasingly shaped by how these elements work together. That is why many analysts caution against judging success solely by battlefield developments. A military strike may achieve its immediate objective, yet long-term strategic outcomes often depend on what happens after the fighting begins. The recent events surrounding the Strait of Hormuz illustrate this complexity. By avoiding a complete closure while still demonstrating the ability to create uncertainty, Iran may have signaled that it prefers measured pressure over maximum escalation. Whether that interpretation proves correct will depend on future developments. But if that approach continues, it suggests a strategy focused less on dramatic confrontation and more on sustained leverage. That distinction matters, because prolonged geopolitical competition often rewards patience rather than speed. While military operations attract global headlines, other forms of competition continue quietly in the background. Research laboratories continue developing new technologies. Factories continue expanding industrial production. Universities continue educating engineers and scientists. Infrastructure projects move forward. Trade agreements evolve. Supply chains adapt. Investment flows shift toward regions perceived as more stable. These developments rarely dominate daily news coverage. Yet over time, they may reshape the international balance of power more profoundly than individual military operations. China's long-term planning offers one example frequently discussed by strategic observers. For years, Beijing has invested heavily in advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, semiconductor development, renewable energy, transportation infrastructure, and industrial modernization. Whether every project achieves its intended goals remains uncertain. No national strategy guarantees success. However, the emphasis on long-term economic and technological capacity reflects an approach that extends well beyond immediate geopolitical crises. For countries navigating an increasingly competitive international environment, resilience has become just as valuable as military strength. Economic diversification, innovation, reliable energy supplies, technological leadership, and diplomatic relationships. Together, these factors determine how effectively nations respond to future challenges. Another important consideration is international perception. Governments constantly evaluate political risk. Businesses reassess investment decisions. Shipping companies monitor transportation routes. Financial institutions adjust exposure. Manufacturers diversify supply chains. These countless decisions, made independently across the global economy, gradually influence patterns of trade, investment, and strategic partnerships. Confidence itself has become an important strategic asset. Countries viewed as stable and predictable often attract greater investment and stronger economic relationships. Conversely, prolonged uncertainty can encourage businesses and governments to seek alternatives. This broader environment helps explain why geopolitical competition today extends far beyond military capabilities alone. Diplomatic credibility matters. Economic resilience matters. Scientific innovation matters. Industrial production matters. Each reinforces national influence in different ways. Looking ahead, several outcomes remain possible. Diplomatic negotiations could gradually reduce regional tensions. Military deterrence may continue without expanding into a larger conflict. Economic cooperation could persist despite political disagreements. Or, new technological and geopolitical developments could reshape today's assumptions entirely. International politics rarely follows a straight line. Unexpected events often change strategic calculations more quickly than experts anticipate. That uncertainty is precisely why careful analysis remains important. Rather than asking only who appears stronger in today's headlines, it is often more useful to ask which decisions are likely to produce sustainable advantages over the next decade. That question applies not only to governments, but also to businesses, investors, and societies preparing for an increasingly competitive global environment. So, what can we conclude from the recent developments? The available evidence suggests several important realities. Regional conflicts now generate global economic consequences almost immediately. Energy security remains central to international politics. Technology and industrial capacity increasingly shape strategic competition. And measured decision-making may, in some circumstances, prove more influential than dramatic escalation. Perhaps the biggest lesson is this: the world's most important geopolitical contests are rarely decided by one battle. They evolve through innovation, economic strength, diplomatic relationships, industrial development, national resilience, and strategic patience. The headlines may focus on today's military events, but beneath those headlines, a much larger story continues to unfold. It is a story about how nations compete for influence in a rapidly changing world. And that story will continue long after the immediate crisis fades from the news. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss future documentaries from Jiang Decoded. What do you think? Was Iran's approach a calculated strategy of restraint, or simply a response to changing circumstances? Share your perspective in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm Jiang, and I'll see you in the next video.